Good morning and welcome to the Adult Forum this morning. I got here bright and early so that everyone could see how beautiful these windows are. First thing in the morning as the sun beats in, these are the six windows, I should say, that Kat will be talking about this morning. I can't wait for you to hear today's lesson that's absolutely wonderful. Before we start, let me say a brief prayer. Lord Jesus, thank you so much for today. Thank you for allowing us to be a part of such a beautiful and wonderful parish. I pray that you will empower Kat as she shares and teaches about each one of these windows. And may we leave here having heard something new from you. In your name, amen.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for stopping in once again for a Trinity Forum Hour and welcome to my home. I just want to tell everyone how much I really appreciated all of the notes and the emails and the messages that I got from last week. I think we're having a great time studying about the windows at our church. I'm here at the barn tonight. Lily's out riding my horse. My husband is splitting wood, but I'm thinking that we need to learn a little more about the windows. So let's go in and let's get started. Thanks again for stopping by.
Hi, everyone. Welcome once again to my home and yet another Forum Hour session. This is a series that is the story behind the light, and we are on part 2. We learned in part 1 about the artist, Joep Nicolas, and now we're going to actually look at his windows that he made for us in the chancel or choir area and the sanctuary. I am Kathryn Gemmer. A lot of people call me Kat. I'm only a layperson, not an expert. I also want to thank today, once again, Skylar Knapp for allowing us to use his photographs of the windows so that we can better understand them. I, in addition, want to give a shout out to this man here. I love this picture of him. Later on, you might appreciate the fact that he's dressed in a lot of blue, and he also has a cross around his neck, and his name is Jerry Isley. He lives in the Gulick house across from the church, but more importantly, in terms of this series, he is an art historian and an art dealer in the DC area and has spent his career studying art. And I thank him for mentoring me and letting me know about all of the art of our church, and particularly being a mentor on the windows today as we look at them. Today, our session has 3 different goals. One, just a basic historical overview of the people in the windows. We're also going to have an introduction to iconography. There are 2 portions of iconography we're going to talk about: colors and symbols. And these were known and fluent to Joep Nicolas in his language in creating stained glass. And I'm going to sort of communicate to you what he did for us in terms of the artwork of our church to tell the stories. And then finally, I hope that this forum series will give you a better understanding of our Christian journey as members of the congregation in Trinity Episcopal in Upperville, Virginia. I want to start out with just a little timeline of the history of the church, because these windows really represent this history. So that's the Episcopal shield up on the upper right-hand corner that all the arrows are pointing to. And on the left side, where you see 33, the undivided church, that gets closer and closer to the death of Christ. So when we look at the timeline, most of our windows fall in that undivided church area, and we're going to talk about 4 windows that were there. And then, as you know, we became the Anglican Communion in England. 2 of the windows will talk to us about that history, which eventually led to the Episcopal Church of America. So interestingly enough, the closer you get to the cross in our church, the closer you get to the inner sanctuary, the closer you get to Christ on that timeline, all the way to the left of that timeline, closer to Christ. And so the very first saint that we're going to look at today, and window that we're going to look at today, is the window of St. George, the patron saint of England. Now, we don't know exactly where he was born, but we do believe that he may have been born and raised in Palestine. Which is very interesting because he's the patron saint of England. And many historians say he never even visited England, but he became a legend in England, and that's the importance of him. The big thing about his story is that the Emperor Diocletian was having all of his soldiers renounce Christ, and it was only St. George, who refused to denounce Christ. And no matter what the emperor did to him in terms of torture, and they were horrific tortures, he would make the sign of the cross and he would say, I am true to Christ. I refuse to denounce Christ. And so that's number one. It came to a point with the emperor that eventually he had St. George beheaded. St. George never came to England. It's said that his head was delivered to Rome and that he's buried in Rome. He became the patron saint of England in the 14th century with King Edward III. Shakespeare also made this saint famous when in a pre-war battle cry in King Henry V, he said, "Cry God for Harry, England, and St. George." And so when you hear that, that's our window. That's the one we're talking about. So St. George was known for his purity of Christ and his devotion to Christ. And so you can see here, oftentimes he's on a white horse, but here Joep Nicolas is decided to make him all in white as a Roman soldier. We're also going to look at some of his legends, but we can see that his name is in blue for wisdom and strength. And the strength that he is showing here is the slaying of a gold and brown leathery dragon, which is one of the legends behind St. George. Before I talk about that, I do want to talk about the St. George Cross because it's so important to us as an Episcopal entity in the United States, but also looking at the Church of England. So here we can see the Vatican has on file in the Codex of St. George some of the earliest pictures of him. And unlike our window, we can see him here. He has a shield and it's a big red cross, and you guys ought to recognize that cross because that cross is the shield that was adopted by the General Convention of 1940 for the United States for the Episcopal Church. So just as a review of this, our first window is St. George when he made the sign of the cross when he was being tortured. This is the cross that we see here that also is the cross of England that we recognize. For our Episcopal Church, in the top, upper left-hand corner, we see a blue square, and that square has in it some of the early Christian crosses. And those early crosses there represent the dioceses that were originally part of the American Diocese of the Episcopal Church. And interestingly enough, in 1785, Virginia is represented by one of those crosses. And that's all St. George, our first window. But that's not what our window is about. Our window is about this painting here that is from the Andrew Mellon collection that is in the National Gallery of Art in DC. So this is St. George. Instead of him being in white, you can see him on a white horse, and he is slaying a dragon. Now, this legend is found in the Golden Legend that was written in the 13th century, and it has many of the legends of the saints. And so St. George was one of the legends that was written about. And in this legend, there was a city that was being besieged by a dragon that would come over the city walls in the evening and would like breathe fire on them. And they were just the people were just so terrified of this dragon. And so they would give the dragon sheep to try to keep him happy. And he didn't like that. So they created a lottery of the children in the city. And they would draw every week or every month, I'm not sure on the timeline, they would draw a name and they would sacrifice that child to the dragon. So St. George was visiting and he came upon a princess who was actually the daughter of the king, whose name had been drawn out of the lot that particular day and was being given to the dragon instead of being married to her bride, her groom-to-be. And St. George came along and said to her, "Why are you so sad?" And she said, "Because I am being given to the dragon." And so he killed the dragon and he rescued the princess. And that's our window. It's such a wonderful story. And every time I look at that window now, I will think of the princess and the hope that St. George gave to her and to the king as he represents Christ, and the dragon there represents evil. As we move away from the sanctuary and more towards the pulpit, we come to our next saint. Now we're still in the sanctuary area, and this is St. Patrick, who we're all familiar with, who is the patron saint of England. Now, St. Patrick was born to an aristocratic family in England, as far as we know. Not sure of the exact place, but it is thought that he was a Christian and he was raised like every teenager in the Christian faith and really didn't believe in it. But as the story goes, he was captured by these Irish pirates and he was taken to Ireland. And in Ireland, he was enslaved for 6 years. And part of his slave duties was to look after the sheep. Now, it so happens that after 6 years, he escaped and he came back to Britain. And you would think, oh, I'm never going back to Ireland again. But he also was a devout Christian at that time and studied Christianity, and he kept having dreams. And Ireland called him. And so he returned to Ireland as a missionary, and he spent the rest of his life there with the people, and he founded Christianity in Ireland. We know a lot about him because he is some of the earliest writings we have of Christianity in England and Ireland and Great Britain. And he wrote an autobiographical book referred to as the Confessio. And so that's how we know a lot about him. As we look at this window here, we see a lot of green. That seems normal since it is St. Patrick. But another thing that I want to point out to you are these Christian crosses that we see. Those are some of the early Christianity crosses when you look at cross variances and iconography. In addition, we can see that his name is in red, which stands for warmth and growth. And then we can see his background is entirely in green, which stands for rebirth, and stands for nature and stands for being one with the earth. Finally, I want to look at the fact that he is standing on a snake or a serpent. And as he's standing on the snake of the serpent, the legend has that he is the one, in spite of the fact there were never any snakes in Ireland, that ran all of the snakes out of Ireland and therefore ran the evilness out of Ireland in his missionary work. This is a couple of his legends. We know that we have the St. Patrick's Day parade and celebration on March 17th. Interestingly enough, I discovered in my studies that the original parade was in New York City and not in Ireland, and I thought that was a lot of fun. But as we look at this particular print from the Flemish engraver, published in 1603, we can see a lot of different stories of St. Patrick and his legends. One of them is the shamrock, which doesn't exist. It could be a three-leaf clover when we're looking at it, but it's said that he went around the countryside in his missionary work talking about the Holy Trinity and using the three-leaf clover for that. In addition, he always carried a walking stick. And if you look back at our window, you'll be able to see at the bottom of the walking stick the roots growing out of it. So it said it was made of ash wood and that he would stab it in the ground anywhere he went and he'd leave it there until he was through telling everybody about Christ. And sometimes it would grow roots and grow into a tree. And then finally, if you look in this picture here in the center, and that's the reason I put it there, because we had talked about the dragon and the last saint, St. George. So here you not only see St. Patrick running the snakes out of Ireland, you see him standing on top of a dragon. And this is for evil and Satan, and that's the representative in iconography for that. So we're moving out of the sanctuary area into the chancel area, and the first window that we see here is St. Augustine. And St. Augustine was the first Archbishop of Canterbury in England and considered the founder of the English Church. So St. Augustine was very learned, and he grew up in Rome, and he became a prior of a Benedictine monastery there. And Pope Gregory the Great really admired him. And Pope Gregory was concerned about England because England at that time, the Romans had left England, and it had become an Anglo-Saxon pagan country. And so Pope Gregory felt like it was time for Christianity to once again be exposed to the Anglo-Saxons, and he was interested in that. So he picked St. Augustine to go there, and St. Augustine was very fearful. And reading some of this historical records, I don't blame him for that. But after several tries, he landed in Kent in England, and he was met by a king and also by his wife, who was Queen Bertha. And she happened to be a Christian. So instead of having this horrifying demise to his livelihood in terms of trying to take Christianity to England, he actually was welcomed there by the king and his wife. And he was taken to Canterbury, where they had an old church, St. Martin's, that was there and existed there. And he built just this fabulous church there. He baptized thousands and thousands of the English. And like I said, he did found the English church. And there are a couple of things I want to point out to you in this particular window. First of all, the red background, the color of courage and self-sacrifice and martyrdom. You can see he's bathed in that. He also has blue around the edges of his window that stand for his wisdom and his connection to Mother Mary and the humanity of Christ. In addition, he is in full bishop's guard, which is very, very appropriate considering he's the first archbishop, and he was very wise and he lived his life and actually turned over his archbishop status to one of his followers and one of his students. But if you look at him, you can see 3 crosses depicted here in the iconography. On his stole is the early Christian cross. Then he has the Augustine cross around his neck. And then usually, if you look at pictures of St. Augustine, he's carrying the Canterbury church, the whole church in his hand. And it's a picture of the church. But here we have him with what is probably considered the Augustine Gospels, because he was quite the evangelist when he went to England. And on the top of that, there's another cross that you see, and that's called the Canterbury cross. So this gives you 3 variants of the cross, all in one window. And he's also probably standing on some of the early Roman stones in this picture. And so that's quite interesting. And up in the top right-hand corner of the slide, we see the Canterbury cross, which I think is one of the most lovely crosses. Next to Augustine, appropriately, is the venerable Bead, and he recorded the study, the history of St. Augustine. He was the author of the Ecclesiastical History of the English People. He's considered one of the greatest historians ever, perhaps in the world, at least in England, and the greatest scholar of his day. He grew up basically living and studying in monasteries, and in 1982 he moved to the Jarrow Monastery, where he spent the rest of his life writing and studying about all of the Christianity in England, and he was quite the expert on that. It's said that in his last days he was in his monastery cell, and that he was continuing to write and continuing to pray to God. I want you to look at this window and all the white in this window, and the fact that his background is humanity in blue. He was very much a man of the people and a monk. You can see that with his sandals and his monk garb, but all in white suggests his purity, including his writings and his pen. He's standing on that wonderful warm red, but look at that pulpit, so to speak, and the bench that he's sitting on, all in gold, which suggests the heavenly world. In addition, we can see his name is in green, and that means rebirth. He was quite the historian and an absolute genius when it comes to writing the history of our church and the beginnings of our church. We're almost to the pulpit. We're closer to the nave and to the pulpit, and so I think it's really fitting that the 2 people that we're going to look at now are John Wickliffe, and then later on we're going to look at Archbishop Cranmer. So John Wickliffe is getting closer to our Episcopal Church and to the Reformation and also to the Anglican Church. He was still in the Roman Catholic Church that had branched off from the Orthodox Church, but he is considered to be a morning star. He was really, really concerned about the corruption of the church at that time, and also concerned about getting into the hands of the people the ability to read the Bible and translating the Bible into a manner that the common people, the lay people, could read. And that's what he's known for. He was educated at Oxford. He became a priest in 1351, and he spent his life devoted to Christ and devoted. He ended up being a rector, but he still was very associated with Oxford. And we can see in his picture right here, he looks like the absolute perfect Oxford scholarly. I didn't say that correctly. Scholarly person. We also see this gold backing on him, which is this heavenly backing that he has, and that's very different than we've seen with the past saints. And we can see that he is also dressed in white and blue, which is for wisdom and for humanity. In addition, we can see the purple of his name, which is looking at the future and also being very true to God. And so he has the pen and he has the book representing some of the first translations of the Bible into English. And this is a quote that he has, and one of the things I want you to note in the quote is that it says, "No pope may say that he is the head." And so you can imagine, I mean, I find it fascinating to find out that he lived out his life, because when you say things like that in the particular climate that the church was in at that time, it's amazing that he did not end up being martyred. It's said that in later years, they actually dug his bones up and burned his bones. I don't know if that's true or not, but this is John Wickliffe, and he was considered the morning star. He did not start the Reformation, but he was one of the early thinkers of that. Just to review some colors and thinking about Joep Nicolas and the colors and the symbols, remember that last quote from our last session, "I must get rid of this inherited need to see things in transparent color." So here we see red, blue, violet, and some of the ideals that they represent. And this was the language of Joep Nicolas, and this is the language of the windows that we're looking at today. Our final window is Archbishop Cranmer. This is the Archbishop that is the nearest to our pulpit, and I want you to notice this window right here. It's so cool. It's got so many colors in it. First of all, the green of his name standing for rebirth, the red of his stole standing for Christ and for the blood of Christ, and also for the fact that he was a martyr. The blue behind him symbolizing the wisdom, the white that symbolized his purity. And also notice his little blue, he was a bishop, so he had his little bishop slippers on, and they were blue too. And I find that to be really cool. So he was the Archbishop of Canterbury in the 16th century, but more importantly, he is the one that was associated with King Henry VIII. As a matter of fact, weirdly enough, they met in the middle of a plague. The Black Plague kept rearing its head up, and Henry and both he had gone to the countryside in Essex and happened to meet one another and became good friends. And that's how he had his influence with King Henry VIII. So he did several things. He presented for the divorce of King Henry from his first wife, Kathryn of Aragon, who was a devout Catholic. After that, when he was with Anne Boleyn, he was sent to Germany to study Lutheranism. When he came back from Germany, he not only became the Archbishop of Canterbury, but he established the Church of England. He is responsible for some of the early Bible translations into English and also some of the litanies, but most importantly, held in his hands right here is our Book of Common Prayer, and so you can see it right there. If you look at him, I want to point out the gold wheat down there next to his name, which stands for martyrdom. And in addition to that, if you'll look at those infinity crosses right there that are on either side of his name, they have black slashes in them that stand for the fact that, yes, indeed, after King Henry died, after Edward VI, Mary I, who was Kathryn of Aragon's daughter, came in to be the queen, and she was Catholic, and she had him burned. And it's said that he would not renounce Christ, but he finally did. And then when he was burned, the hand on which he made the vow to renounce Christ, he put into the flame first. And so it's quite dramatic, and that's the last window. I want to end today with the real story behind the windows for me, and that's the story of our choir. Here's Christian. For those of you that have not been to our outdoor services, we open some of these beautiful windows of our transepts that I hope to talk to you about someday. And the choir has been able to sing through those windows. And so they're behind the windows, and this behind the scenes. I thank Christian and also our section leader so much for being the artist that, just like the artists of Joep Nicolas, continue to spread the word of God through their particular ministry. And you can see this is a working environment for them. And they are musicians and not stained glass artists, but like stained glass artists, like all of the artists of all the churches around the world, these are the people that promote the word of Christ and help us learn the stories of God through the artistic medium. Thank you so much, Christian. Thank you so much for everyone today. I miss the choir. I miss you all, and I hope to see you next week.